Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched episode 7 of What If. Let's talk about it. So at this point in time, if I'm being honest, I am starting to regret my pledge to review every single episode of What If on a weekly basis. My weekly schedule is falling apart. I'm so sorry. But I just find it hard to justify getting ready to film, coming on here just to talk about one episode of What If and not being able to cover anything else. I feel like it makes more sense for me to review other things alongside What If. So that's what I've been trying to do these past couple of weeks. And yeah, I just feel like the series would have been better off reviewed overall at the end. So I could give you guys my overall thoughts, even though we have been able to go into deep dives with every single episode. I just feel like it would have been fine if I just given you a series review, although I do appreciate each and every one of you who have been checking out my reviews as the weeks have gone on. I feel like that's why I'm still doing these, because I love you guys' interactions and your thoughts and feelings of these episodes so far. So yeah, I'm still gonna stick it out the whole 9 episodes, but yeah, I have small amounts of regrets, but I'm sticking to my commitment, and whenever these land, they will definitely be up on my channel at some point. But today we are going to be talking about episode 7 of What If. But before we delve into my thoughts, as per usual, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. Now, without further ado, let's get into this. So for episode 7, the central question is, what if Thor had been an only child? What if the relationship that Thor has with his brother, this core foundation in his character within the MCU, no longer existed because Odin, instead of taking Loki as a baby and raising him as his own in Asgard, returned him to King Laufey and created this whole new dynamic within the royal family in Jotunheim, and the series of events played out in an entirely different way, and that ended up with Thor being raised as an only child under Odin and Frigga, turning out to be quite spoiled, and the kind of Thor that we see at the beginning of the first Thor film that doesn't really go through the character arc that we see him go through in that live action film. So that's the kind of premise of this episode, and the answer to that question is essentially he becomes a party boy. He becomes a party boy. He throws parties that destroys whole planets, as Jane Foster was able to spot. So yeah, that's kind of what we explore in this episode, and honestly, I was here for it. Honestly, I really enjoyed this episode. It was so much fun. It was really cool seeing this version of Thor who's just so free and just so funny as well. I feel like Chris Hemsworth nailed it. Chris Hemsworth knocked it out of the park with his vocal performance as Thor in this episode. Just mwah, magnifique. I've been saying throughout these weeks that there have been certain actors where you could have either taken them or left them. It really doesn't matter the fact that they voice the characters that they portray in live action. Jeremy Renner. But in the case of Chris Hemsworth, it was undoubtedly Chris Hemsworth. It was 100% Chris Hemsworth as Thor, and I absolutely loved it. It was also quite clearly influenced by his portrayal of the character in Thor Ragnarok as opposed to how he was portrayed in the first Thor film, because even though in the first Thor film there are quite a few comedic moments and the character of Thor has always been kind of goofy in that way, Another came from the first Thor film, but you can definitely tell that the comedic beats lean more towards what Taika Waititi did in Thor Ragnarok, and I think that fits the character so well. I feel like Taika was able to identify where this character shines the best, and that is when he's not taking himself too seriously, when he's not being a DC character. When he's not being a DC character, okay? Because no one wants that in the MCU. So I do like the fact that this episode leaned into that, and like I said, Chris Hemsworth did the job. He did the job in terms of delivering that vocal performance for the character. Same with Tom Hiddleston, as I've been saying, the guy doesn't know how to do a bad job. Him as Loki, wow. We'll get to that in a second, okay? Let's talk about the party atmosphere at the beginning. So at the very beginning of the episode, we see Jane Foster in the middle of the desert, as we found her at the beginning of the first Thor film, the first Thor film. Speaking of thirsty, okay, we'll talk about that in a second. But we see her using her apparatus and she's able to identify an anomaly, which is essentially Thor coming on Earth. And he lands in Las Vegas, the epicenter to what becomes a global party, which to me is just genius. Like, of course he would land in Las Vegas. So he has this party where everyone is invited. Initially there's this moment of like fear, like, oh my god, it's an alien invasion, but then you quickly realize that he's not a threat, he's just there to have a good time. And he invites a bunch of other extraterrestrial beings from all across the MCU. Like, we see quite a few aliens that have appeared in the Guardians of the Galaxy films, we see a few Guardians of the Galaxies themselves. So it's a really cool mashup of, you know, these characters from space arriving on Earth just to have a good time. So when Jane discovers this anomaly, she does end up calling S.H.I.E.L.D., but no one answers her, like no one takes her seriously. She even has to try and call the parks department just to reach someone in government, but again, no one's taking her seriously. So she ends up going straight to Thor herself to try and talk to him, and she's making a big deal about the fact that she's the first one to have contact with the first alien to make contact on Earth. But then Darcy's just like, sis, like, look who's surrounding him. Like, everyone has already made contact with him. You're like one of the last people. And then she points to like Howard the Duck, and she's like, if you want to make contact with someone that no one's talking to, like, here you go, like, go talk to Howard the Duck. And then Howard the Duck is like, hey, like, you're not even blonde. Like, that's such a funny exchange to see Howard the Duck interacting with Darcy, some pretty comedic characters within the MCU. And they actually end up getting married. They have this like classic, is it a shotgun wedding? It's like a spontaneous wedding that we see time and time again when it comes to characters who pop into Las Vegas. They go get married at a chapel and they're married off by an Elvis impersonator. Like, it's just, mwah, it's classic, okay? And Darcy ends up becoming Mrs. the Duck. But yes, Jane finally gains the confidence to go up to Thor and ask him about the previous events which led to a star or a small planet exploding or something. Something happened because of one of his previous parties, and she has the data on her apparatus to show that. And when Thor first meets Jane, he can't even see her. He's like looking at his own peripheral vision, and he has to look all the way down because she's so small. And he's saying like he almost stepped on her because she's so tiny. That's that cute exchange that they had in the first Thor film, but again, it leans more towards the comedy that we see in Thor Ragnarok, which I think is a really nice blend. And when it comes to the relationship between Jane and Thor, it's had a bit of a rough time in the MCU. I feel like it's similar to how I thought of Doctor Strange and his relationship with Christine, in that I was never really invested in their love story, and it's a similar thing here, except in contrast to what happened in the Doctor Strange episode, where it really delved into Doctor Strange's feelings for Christine and the fact that he was mourning the loss of her in that episode. Here, they don't really do much to salvage the relationship between Jane and Thor. Like, it really is just at the bottom of their list of priorities. Because at the beginning, they meet up, they have a fun time during the party in Vegas, they get like tattoos. Thor gets a science tattoo, Jane gets a magic tattoo, like, it's cute. And then later on, you know, you see the morning after and they're all in the same room and it's like rough, but she's already so invested in him. And to me, it's like she has a crush on Chris Hemsworth, which, you know, fine. She has a crush on animated Chris Hemsworth, completely valid, completely justifiable, but that doesn't spell an interesting or, you know, passionate love story in my book. But in that scene, in the next morning, Jane is woken up by a very loud knock by none other than, I think it's Brock Rumlow, who knocks on the door on behalf of S.H.I.E.L.D. And it turns out that S.H.I.E.L.D. finally came because they realized that her warning was very valid. And so they take her to the helicarrier where they're asking her all these questions about how she knew that an alien was going to land on Earth, finally taking her seriously. And Maria is actually in charge here. She is the acting director, because it turns out that Nick Fury ended up getting like thrown across the country in the previous night during the Vegas party when he was trying to interact with Thor himself. So we see Maria take charge here. There's quite a strong presence of female characters in this episode overall. We see how Thor is terrified of his mother. We see the entrance of Captain Marvel, which we'll talk about in a second. And then of course you have Jane and Darcy at the center of this story as these Thor characters. But after getting some intel from Jane, and Jane trying to persuade Maria not to do anything crazy because this could inform the diplomatic relations between human beings and extraterrestrial beings for generations to come. And Darcy's looking at Jane like, diplomatic relations, eh? But you know, Jane is trying to pull Maria back, but she's already decided to bring in the big gun straight up. And so she gets, I think it's Brooke Rumlow again, they get this kind of special package, like the special box. And then when we open up the box, it reveals this pager, which we know Nick Fury had in order to contact none other than Captain Marvel. So she is called upon, and then we flip back over to Thor to see what he's been up to, and this party has gone worldwide. He is hanging out in Paris because he had this kind of craving for some Parisian patisserie. So he lands himself in France and he invites more of his friends, including none other than Loki and his fellow Frost Giants. And this is the first time that we get to see Loki in Frost Giant form in the animated version, but also in live action since his appearance in the first Thor film, because there we got to see a glimpse of like Jotun Loki, but we didn't really get a lot of that. And also there was a glimpse of that as well in an episode of Loki, I believe, but again, we didn't really get a lot. Here we get to see like the Jotun version of Loki, the Frost Giant version of Loki, and like I love to see it. It was so hilarious. It was the funniest thing in the world. First of all, he's introduced as Thor's brother from another mother, which like, get it, like haha kiki. The fact that even though Loki wasn't raised alongside Thor, they still managed to find one another and develop this kind of brotherly relationship, I think is really cool. And I just love the idea of Loki popping up on Thor's adventures and like knowing him really well, knowing when Thor is gonna get out to no good, get out to some mischief himself and throw these massive parties and just going along for the ride. But then when the going gets tough, when the going gets tough, Loki is out. Like when the going gets tough, Loki's like, ooh, this doesn't sound like my problem, like I'm not gonna stick around for this, and he just leaves like immediately. I absolutely loved that. And also another scene that literally had me laughing out loud is the scene where Jane calls Thor's phone and she's trying to reach him, and Loki picks up and he's like, hello, like you're Thor's lady friend. And he's like flirting with her but also trying to see if she has any friends, okay? But then at the end, just when Jane is trying to make some inquiries, Loki drops the phone and it literally you see it just like flipping down and landing on the ground after ages because of how tall Loki is in this episode. And it's the funniest thing in the world because he doesn't even reach down to pick it up. That's the funniest thing. He doesn't try to save the phone. He just watches it fall and then he's just like, oh my, like he's just like, oh, that just happened. So yeah, I really enjoyed the introduction of Frost Giant Loki here, but the main storyline of course focuses in on Thor, you know, raving around, throwing these massive parties across the world, using important historical landmarks as like party games, as props for his shenanigans. It's just this disregard that he has for Midgard. I mean, he even calls it a backwater planet. That's the kind of planet that he goes to because he knows that Heimdall is less likely to be watching there. So yeah, it's the disregard that he has, the disrespect, even though he's told his mother that he's, you know, studying he's studying the 9 rounds in preparation for becoming king. But then, as I mentioned, we do get the entry of Captain Marvel, who's called upon by Maria to deal with the whole Thor situation, and I think they have some pretty good banter, you know, between Thor and Captain Marvel. Obviously Captain Marvel is super serious and she wants him out of here because she knows that he poses as a threat, but Thor is just really jokey, not really taking anything seriously. So they have some pretty good banter, and I find it funny how they look similar as characters. They look quite similar. They're both blonde characters, they look the same, okay, but at the same time their ideologies and their maturity is just completely different. Even though Thor is the elder one, like he is thousands of years old, but he still acts like a child, and this episode suggests that a large part of that is because he didn't grow grow up with a brother like Loki that always challenged him, shall we say. Then we see the battle royale that honestly no one ever asked for, but we kind of want anyways, and that was between Thor and Captain Marvel. We finally got to see them fight it out against one another, and honestly, like, both of them took hits. I was very surprised at how violent and vicious both characters were against one another. You could definitely tell they were pulling their punches. Like, it wasn't like an Avengers level threat where one of them was trying to kill the other, but you know, she was really trying to toss him around and he was doing the same to her. Like, at first he took it as a joke, but then he was like, hang on a minute, she's this is all part of his fun. Like, this is all part of his vacation. So Captain Marvel ends up dragging him around all of these different places, and later on Darcy even gives the gang the idea of, you know, taking Thor to a desolate area where they can do as much damage as they want, and that's exactly what she ends up doing. They end up going to Siberia, where they battle it out once again, but then their fight is interrupted by none other than Frigga, Thor's mother, who was summoned by Jane because things are getting a bit out of hand. And Jane has feelings for Thor. She doesn't want to see him destroyed, okay? And also there's this talk about a nuke. Like, you know, Maria's like, let's get the nukes out just in case Captain Marvel gets distracted by a cat, which I feel like was kind of disrespectful to Captain Marvel. Like, she seemed pretty serious in this episode. She wasn't about to get distracted by any cats, okay? But Maria isn't taking any chances. She's ready to get the nukes out. So Jane takes matters into her own hands and calls up Thor's mum, just as Darcy suggested as well. Darcy's coming up with these great ideas, okay? And so we see Frigga appear in this hologram, and Thor is terrified. Thor is like, oh no, someone called my mom, like, the party's over, okay? So he tries to go back to tell the rest of the gang that the party's done, and like I said, the rest of the gang aren't having it. Loki's like, oh, this is your problem. This has nothing to do with me. Like, I just wanted to have a good time, but now the party is done. Like, I'm off. And then we even see Drax, who isn't voiced by Dave Bautista, but still he very much echoes the Drax that we know in the MCU proper. And he's just like, well, you're the party pooper now. You're the one who's party pooping. So he ends up using his, I guess, like, Odin voice. I don't know what that was, but this like very powerful voice that he has. He summons his lightning and he tries to get everyone in line to help him sort out the mess that he created in Midgard. And honestly, I felt like it was a bit unfair for him to like throw it on everyone else because it was his doing. But at the same time, they were all having a good time, so everyone had to chip in to clean up the mess too. So then in the end, he is able to clean up Midgard just in time for Frigga to arrive. He set up this like fake outdoor classroom pretending to be teaching people, and we even have Captain Marvel in the end helping him out, talking about this syllabus that she got with CBS and all that. It was just nonsense, but I think it was really funny and cute seeing how terrified Thor was, knowing that his mum was about to arrive on Midgard and see the tomfoolery that he was actually up to. And then Frigga arrives, and obviously she knows something is up. Like, this woman is what, thousands of years old? She knows something is up, but she's like, okay, I'll allow it, until Thor ruins it for himself and calls his hammer, and his hammer is still looking like it was lost in the middle of Mardi Gras. Like, his hammer is looking a mess. But then at the very end, we do see the love story between Thor and Jane kind of come full circle. And like I said, I wasn't really invested in that love story in this episode. I don't feel like we got enough time to explore their love story. For the majority of the episode, Jane and Thor are literally like on two separate parts of the world. So that love story really wasn't going to be convincing to me, although it's great that Natalie Portman came back to voice the character. But at the very end is where we get the spice, right? Because as we determined a few weeks ago, each of these episodes have been ending in these horrible, horrific cliffhangers. They have all had bad endings. And this week's episode doesn't disappoint, because we see an entry of an army of Ultron bots, and they are being led by Ultron himself. Except when we see the helmets that Ultron has lift up, we actually see Vision behind the helmet. So it's Vision that is controlling this version of Ultron, and you know, hopefully we'll get a chance to see why that is, what's going on there, and what becomes of Midgard in light of this bombastic ending. But at the very end there, what really struck me was just how surprised the Watcher was, because once again, as we determined determined in last week's episode, the Watcher has been watching more and more closely as the weeks have gone on. We've been able to see more of him as the weeks have gone on, and this episode, like I said, was no exception, where we actually got to see the Watcher in all his tanned glory, in all his Jeffrey Wright-esque glory, okay? And so we get to see him very up close, and he's ready to wrap things up with a happily ever after, until of course the Ultron bots come along, and he seemed genuinely surprised. He's like, wait, what? Like, he's literally like, oh, okay, like there's a twist here, almost as if he didn't expect this to happen. And I'm not sure if the Watcher can see past, present and future. Like, I don't know if he can see all timelines or if he just watches the present everywhere, but it seems as though he was genuinely surprised by the series of events at the very end, maybe suggesting that they weren't supposed to happen that way, like maybe suggesting that destiny has changed. And I wonder what has changed that. I wonder if it's because of Doctor Strange's actions in the previous episode, or if it's because of some actions that we've seen in the live action MCU projects, for example Loki. Like, I wonder if that's going to tie into the ending that we see in this episode of What If. But that's it from me. I'm so sorry, I felt like I kind of rushed that review a little bit, but I do need to head to somewhere. I do need to head to somewhere, I apologize. And now that I told you guys my thoughts on episode 7 of What If, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this episode down in the comments below. Did you enjoy it as much as I did? I definitely feel like it's in the top 5 episodes so far, although there are only 7. But that's not saying much. That's not saying much. Top 4 episodes, I'll say, comfortably, because I really did have a fun time with it. But it's all about how this kind of wraps up at this point. Like, to me, it's all about the payoff, because so far we have gotten the first parts of these stories, and I need to see how they end. But what do you guys think? Share your thoughts down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.